Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I truly hope you're doing exceedingly well. Loads and loads of love to each and every one of you, and don't forget to keep lovely and warm because it's still icy cold out there, so you might need that lovely hot cup of cocoa, and don't forget to top it up with lots of marshmallows because I've got a lovely story for you. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Patrick, but people tend to call me Pat for short, and I'm from the Golden State of Ohio, which is the smallest state west of the Appalachian Mountains. But what it lacks for in size, it more than makes up for with breathtaking, beautiful scenery. Our Elysian state is home to ravishing sights from nature, such as masterful waterfalls, rugged canyons, flowery meadows, thriving wetlands, lakefront beach scenes, and dense verdant woodland. And we are also home to whimsical, charming Amish country. The variable weather here and the changing seasons is so typical of the central United States. We experience rainy springs, warm to humid summers, beautiful crisp and colourful autumns, and cold snowy winters, especially in the Great Lake regions, where it can get incredibly cold. My favourite part of the year is naturally autumn. I love the way the arresting trees change from golds to reds, russets and pinks, because the world becomes so exquisitely arrayed in mesmerising, resplendent colours that I can't stop marvelling at. As I always say to my family in regards to our utopian state, that sometimes the very best things in life tend to come in small packages, and I definitely feel that way about Ohio. It's also pretty cool that we do have a relatively low cost of living here compared to other states. I run our joint relatively small proficient business, or dairy if you like, here with my father, and this extraordinary productive enterprise has been a generational family passion and interest since my great-great-grandfather's day. My beloved and precious extended family lives together on this farm, working as an industrious team, which enables things to run methodically and smoothly. I do hire outside help to help us in managing the dairy, which makes our operation even more auspicious and lucrative, as many hands do indeed make life work. We have a couple of very large cow barns, also storage barns, a machine shed, milk parlour, and the list goes on, but you get the general gist of things. Our farm is very sizable, with acres of grazing pasture, ubiquitous natural wood green consisting of oak, hickory and maple and beech trees. Then there are open prairies, a silvery creek, a couple of ponds, and a gushing stream that literally meanders and zigzags through the large wooded area on our land, which is a haven for the indigenous wildlife here, from white-tailed deer, short-tailed shrews, red squirrels, snowshoe hares, voles, red foxes, coyotes, raccoons, skunks, bobcats, coyotes, and you name it, we probably have it. I live in a large white brick symmetrical 3-storey farmhouse with double-hung windows and emerald green shutters, and also a matching roof, as well as a stunning green front door. Around the rear of our property we possess a wraparound porch that overlooks a very large silvery pond that is flanked by the most exquisite large willow trees. I grew up on this picturesque pastoral farm from when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, with my 2 sisters who now currently both reside in the city of Columbus, both married to their respective partners and are working in town rather than the country, which is a huge change of lifestyle for them. They willingly both admit and concede that they miss the laid-back, mellow, easygoing and serene lifestyle here at our farm. Don't let me mislead you or give you a false impression for a moment. Let me make it exceedingly clear that farm life can be very strenuous, toilsome and tough. It is indeed hard work, but being close to my animals and to nature is my huge passion. It's an idealised halcyon and peaceful existence, or should I say for me personally, as close to heaven as I can get. I savour and cherish every moment of living here with my extended and magnificent family, and my 2 blessed children, Jennifer and Simon, whom both love having their grandparents around. This setup would never work if we weren't a very close family in the first place, which thankfully we are. I'm blessed that my mother and wife are the very best of friends. In truth, I think if they weren't, it would be very problematic. If I divorced my wife, I'd probably be the one turfed out of the farmhouse first, because my mother would definitely turf me out before my wife, because they're that close. I raise Jersey cows, which is the second largest breed of cattle dairy in the world, that originated from the island of Jersey, hence their name. They're excellent grass grazers and produce the richest, most delicious milk that you've ever tasted, with over 5% butterfat and over 3% protein. Jersey cow milk is richer in calcium than standard milk. Another thing I'd like to add about Jersey cows is that they have gentle, docile personalities and are congenial and exceedingly friendly, with really laid-back, easygoing temperaments. My strange, rather curious story begins with two Jersey cows of mine, one called Magnolia and the other Clover. They began to behave very strangely and exhibit queer, baffling and rather peculiar habits that were incredulous and outlandish. I would go so far as to say they were acting like two bank robbers, furtive and suspicious, as if they were up to something very naughty that they knew very well was wrong. Now, as a farmer, these two cows were exceptionally special to me, because they had rather quirky, capricious, gregarious personalities, and were very loving by nature and remarkably bright and intelligent. I began to notice that either one of these two cows would always be mysteriously missing when it came to rounding up the cows for their milking. It would seem that either Magnolia or Clover had all but vanished into thin air. Ironically, never both of them at the same time. Only one of them would always be at the dairy, while the other one could not be found at all. Stranger still is that whenever Magnolia or Clover were milked, their milk yield was exceedingly low and exceptionally poor. I knew something very peculiar was going on, but I couldn't make any sense of it at all. I was very perturbed and perplexed. When my vet visited the farm to give my animals a general check-up, I told him all about Magnolia and Clover's plight, and about their poor milk yield, which I couldn't understand. He assured me that they were both of sound health, and seemed even more robust than usual, and appeared to be thriving well. "There is no reason why their milk yield is low," he assured me. "It doesn't make any sense to me at all. I've never seen them in such fine health." So one day I decided to follow Magnolia, but I realised when I was around she stuck with several cows grazing in the meadows, and she kept looking at me and surreptitiously kept a close eye on me at all times while she pretended to be focusing on her grazing. If the cows would move to another area, she would follow them, but kept glancing up briefly in my direction to discern if I'd left the field yet. I am certain she was thinking, "When is he going to leave? What is he hanging around for? I wish to goodness he would just go." I knew she wanted me gone. That was when I knew that she definitely was hiding a secret from me, and I wanted to find out what was going on. My curiosity was aroused. I walked away from the pasture and returned, but this time by stealth, sneakily making very sure that Magnolia had not seen me, because she was one clever, discerning cow, and she could notice things very easily. As for Clover, she was nowhere to be found, but I knew that in some way their disappearances and reappearances were connected and interlinked in some way. I carefully manoeuvred my 6-foot slender frame behind a large maple tree and tried very hard to remain as still as I possibly could, hoping with all my heart that I wouldn't be observed. I saw that Magnolia was ascertaining that everything was indeed safe. I watched her large face and curious bright brown eyes, scrutinising the field and sniffing the air. When she finally looked satisfied and was certain that she was safe to finally leave, and that I was not on sight poking around, she decided that she was indeed safe to go and to exit the field. I discerned that she very hastily left the other cows and hurriedly moved away, constantly evaluating her surroundings while she did so. She ambled cautiously through the wood green to a remote quarter, to, I imagine, her assembly point and meeting place with Clover, my other cow. Once Clover saw Magnolia, that was her cue to leave the wood green to join the other cows in the grazing pastures. I was to discover, to my astonishment and absolute amazement, that these two mothers were working in a joint alliance together, and had insightfully and sagaciously divided shifts between themselves, and they had both given birth to their own individual calves that they'd hidden from me in the Sylvan. They were sharing joint parental responsibilities. Now, how profound, savvy and intelligent you have to be to do that. I knew at once that they'd grown sick and tired of having their calves always taken away from them, and their maternal instinct was in overdrive, and it was so strong that they were taking turns to nurse and babysit the two calves. This explained why their udders were always dry. I'm not exaggerating when I say I was moved to tears from what I was observing, and from that point on I ensured that Clover and Magnolia could continue raising their calves without them being taken away from them. When you see things like this occurring in nature, you become all too aware that animals have feelings and emotions just like humans do. What right did I have to stop Clover and Magnolia from enjoying the privileges of motherhood, if it meant so very much to them? Maybe I'm a soppy farmer, but I rarely was so moved by this incredible incident and the lengths that both of my two cows went to hide their calves from me. It really showed an extraordinary level of emotional intelligence. I have worked with dairy cows for many years, and I really do see them as having their own individual personalities, which is why I know them all by name and usually can tell them apart. I name every one of my cows because they're not just a number to me. I consider myself exceedingly privileged to work with these creatures and that they've actually crossed my path. I emphatically believe that every living creature has a soul on this earth. I remember when one of my cows called Savannah sadly passed away before the vet could get around to euthanizing her, as her death was very fortuitous and serendipitous. For some unexplained precocious reason, she became seriously ill, and the vet believed she might have eaten something very poisonous in the meadow. Personally, I have to be with my animals when they're dying to comfort them and reassure them. I do find animals have a very different attitude towards death than we have, as they seemingly have no fear of the afterlife and are very accepting and almost welcoming of it. On this occasion I was stroking Savannah and talking to her, thanking her for her calves and her milk supply that she had given to us over the years, and for being such an asset to my herd. I could tell my presence really comforted her at this critical moment in time. I will never forget when she died. I actually physically saw a light orb leaving her body at the moment of death, and it was utterly incredible. I believe it was her soul. The very next morning there was a red-shouldered hawk on my yard fence, and it watched me go about my business and followed me around the whole morning. That sort of thing doesn't just happen at random. I really felt it was a clear sign from Savannah to say that she was absolutely fine. When you live so close to nature as I do with animals, you see things in the natural world that are so extraordinary they defy natural explanation. So I know emphatically that we never die but move on to another realm of existence. I gather they have proved that our bodies weigh a few ounces less after death, and one scientist firmly believes that this proves the existence of the soul. I'm in no doubt that he's right about that. Going back to my story, one day the same problem arose again for me during the milking in the dairy, as one of my cows, Marigold, was failing to produce any milk, and I immediately suspected that she was hiding a calf somewhere in the wood green from me. It seemed like I had another cow that was being equally as determined to keep her calf hidden from me, and so once again I decided to follow her to see what she was up to, and I hid behind a large maple tree. I could discern that her behaviour was even more peculiar than Magnolia and Clover's had been. She was standing in the sylvan as if she was waiting for someone, and began to moo very, very loudly, as if she was trying to get someone's attention. I then heard a human whistle, answering that moo, and was very, very surprised and perturbed. I was expecting a calf to come running out of the thicket towards her to hungrily feed from her udder, but that was not what I saw. I heard a loud rustling sound that sounded like a pair of heavy bipedal feet were walking towards Marigold. Then I saw him, and nothing was to prepare me for what I was discerning. The only way I can describe him to you was that he looked like a humanoid ape, and was about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 3 foot wide. He was covered in a coat that rather reminded me of a red fox, but infinitely more luxurious and magnificent than that, because the kaleidoscope of rich red colours was so bedazzling. The hair was unfortunately very matted and dirty, and the critter was well in need of a bath. He smelt like my sneakers at the time in my life when I'd caught athlete's foot in a very bad way, and it took a few months for me to shift that infection. I was well acquainted with that yeasty, musty, wet dog kind of smell that once had been a problem for me. The creature was so muscular and powerful looking, with very overlong arms and powerful legs, and a cone-shaped head that seemed to flow seamlessly into the shoulders with no evidence of a neck. And the head was very broad in its width, but long in its shape, with a prominent brow ridge, very wide flat nose, and very deep-set golden eyes. The skin appeared leathery and thick, and was a deep tan colour, but it wasn't black or grey. Suddenly I realised to my utter astonishment that I was actually studying a Bigfoot, as the creature did look exactly like the humanoid ape so often described in documented reports and accounts. I'm afraid I'd never believed that such a critter could actually exist here in North America. But now I was seeing one in close quarters, close up and personal, and I knew indeed that it was real. I was absolutely gobsmacked and thunderstruck by what I was discerning. The Bigfoot was carrying 3 of the old pail buckets that my great-grandfather's generation used to use in the olden days for milking by hand. I have dozens of those pails in one of my cow sheds. In 2 of those steel buckets, he was carrying hundreds of apples that he'd broken up into smaller chunks that clearly came from our neighbours' apple orchards. No wonder Marigold was interested in these little rendezvous, as she'd always been predisposed to having a rather sweet tooth, and once when I'd accidentally left the feeding barns open, she had managed to devour a whole food trough of molasses. I could see by the naughty glint in her eye that stealing the molasses was infinitely more fun than being given it directly. I could tell that she looked ever so pleased with herself. Since then I noticed she always had her eye on that barn door, so that she could covertly go pilferaging should I accidentally leave it open again. The large hairy humanoid or Bigfoot I was watching poured out 2 huge buckets of broken up apples onto the ground, and then he turned one upside down and sat on it, although he looked like a man trying to sit on a kid's tricycle because the pail was way too tiny to support his hefty, sizable buttocks, but that seemed of no hindrance to him, as his balance was excellent. He began to squeeze and manipulate Marigold's udders, and proceeded to milk her while she ate the apples. The expression on Marigold's face was one of absolute ecstasy, because she was getting a huge sugar high, and she chewed the apples extra slowly to savour the sweet taste. The hairy critter milked her very efficiently, tweaking her udders like a true professional, filling the pail with her milk, and once the 2 pails were full, he stood up and began to drink from one of the steel buckets. I kid you not when I say this. This Bigfoot lifted a huge bucket of milk in the air, like you or I would drink a mug of coffee and take it to our lips, and he began to drink from it with such extraordinary strength. I mean, who can do that? I noted some of the extra milk started to spill down on his coat, and also rimmed the edges of his mouth, so that he looked like he was wearing a white moustache. He licked his lips appreciatively, and I could tell he thoroughly enjoyed the milk. I was amazed that the critter actually enjoyed drinking milk, but then I suppose they're a lot like us, so why shouldn't they? Marigold was still eating her apple pieces and looking absolutely elated and rapturous, as if she was on cloud 9. It seemed like a great relationship or arrangement, if you like, as for her giving up milk in exchange for apples was a very good deal. Before long the big critter began to stroke Marigold devotedly, like you would a dog, and he chatted away to her affectionately in a strange language that sounded a lot like gibberish. And then finally he gathered the 2 large buckets, now filled with milk, and glided away with a seamless grace, while Marigold reluctantly returned back to the herd. I say reluctantly because Marigold's insatiable sweet tooth means that if she could eat molasses, oats and sweet apples for the rest of her born days, she would be euphoric and delirious with happiness. Even my kids adore feeding Marigold sweet fruits behind my back, most especially apples. They confided in me that they love the sheer look of gleeful rapture in her eyes, and the way she chooses to eat the food that we give her so slowly to savour its sweetness. I mean, isn't that extraordinary? As you can imagine, when I sat down at the dinner table that night, I stared out vacantly into space, much like you do when you've had a shock and your mind is 1,000 miles away. That was the effect that meeting a Bigfoot had on me. "Pat," said my mother, "Pat, are you going to have some cornbread or not?" "Oh, thanks," I said, reaching out for a piece. "What's up with you?" said my mother. "You look like you're not compos mentos today. You look 1,000 miles away. What's going on?" "Yes, honey," said my wife, stroking my hand gently. "You've barely touched your food. It's not like you at all. You normally eat like a horse." "Very odd," said my father. "Pat has the healthiest appetite I know. What's going on with you, son?" "I saw a Bigfoot today," I said. "You saw what?" said my mother. I saw a Bigfoot, I repeated. Now that you don't believe me, pass me the carrots. Who said we don't believe you, son? Said my father. I believe you. What's a Bigfoot, Mummy? Asked Jennifer. It's a very big man covered in hair, darling, with big feet and very long arms. I've seen one of those, said Jenny, in the wood green, but he ran away. He was covered with hair like a fox. You saw him? I asked Jennifer, looking amazed. I've seen him about 2 or 3 times, Daddy. He hides behind the trees watching us play. He's shy, but he likes to watch us. I've seen him spying on us too, said Simon. He is shy, but his hair's a very nice colour. My father had an experience with a Bigfoot on this farm once, said my grandfather. It must be from the same family line, because he described it as having a coat like a fox. He said he wished Mother wore her hair in that colour. Why did you not tell us this before? I asked my father. For the very same reason people tend to not talk about Bigfoot, the fear of not being believed. But I would have believed you, Father. I know you would never lie. Well, one of my father's calves was having difficulty being born. The cervix hadn't dilated properly, and her uterus was exhausted. The cow was having twins, and it was a difficult birth. My father went to get the forceps to help with the delivery, and when he returned to the barn, he saw a large red-haired Bigfoot helping the cow deliver its 2 calves. Of course, he didn't know it was a Bigfoot at the time. He said that the critter looked like a humanoid ape and was female. When the critter saw him, she fled away very quickly, but she did a great job in assisting the cow in a very safe delivery of 2 of the twins, and my father was not sure he would have delivered those calves quite so safely, or even alive, because it was such a tumultuous, challenging birth that rarely required veterinary help. But there was no time for any of that, so he had to act quickly, and thankfully she intervened. I remember he was bedazzled and stunned by what he'd seen, as he had no idea what on earth she was. He described her as a wild woman covered in luxurious red hair, and he went to the grave never knowing the answers to his many long questions. Of course, he never made any talk about it to the local folk, because on one occasion he recalls one of the locals talking about seeing a dark humanoid ape, and everyone teasing him tirelessly. People called him Monkey Face and asked him if he'd seen any monkeys running around the woods lately. They would scoff all the time. So as you can imagine, my father told my mother and I we were to keep our lips sealed and locked at all times. And we did, of course. I bet you other people must have seen Bigfoot in those days, I reflected, but they all shut up about it. Of course they did. As they do today, reflected my mother. I mean, if I saw one, I wouldn't tell anyone about it. I can assure you of that. After my family discussed in detail my extraordinary encounter with the milk-drinking Bigfoot, we unanimously agreed that Marigold should continue to receive apples from the Bigfoot and in return enjoy her stash of apples. I knew that my milk yield is well in excess of what I sell, so losing a little milk here and there is no train smash for me. I'm a firm believer in working with the flow of the natural world and not against it, because that way your life is intrinsically blessed with bountiful blessings. Well, that's been my experience anyway. So there you are. That's my story. Oh my word, I love that story. Wow, a milk-drinking Bigfoot. Who would have actually thought about it? And I loved your description of the milk being drunk by that creature, lifting that huge bucket to his lips. Can you imagine us being able to do that? We just couldn't do it at all. So until next time, goodbye and good night.